It began in the quiet halls of Miami University, an ordinary afternoon that would soon shatter every illusion of safety academia ever promised. A gifted but tormented philosophy student, Gabriel Young, walked into his professor's office carrying more than just a failed thesis. He carried a death sentence. Within minutes, the room that once echoed with debate fell silent, and a beloved professor lay dead beside the very statue that symbolized his life's work. But this wasn't the act of a man on the run. When police arrived, Gabriel didn't hide, didn't cry, didn't even flinch. He simply waited, calmly, almost proudly, as if the murder were a philosophical exercise he needed to complete. What could drive a scholar obsessed with ethics to commit such a cold, deliberate crime, and then beg for the death penalty? This is the story of the crime that stunned Florida, baffled psychologists, and forced a courtroom to confront the question, when knowledge turns deadly, who decides what justice truly means? Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, make sure to like this video if you enjoy real-life courtroom documentaries, and subscribe so you never miss stories that blur the line between logic and madness. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. And if you were the judge in this case, what sentence would you have delivered? It was supposed to be an ordinary Wednesday at Miami University, the kind of sunlit afternoon when palm leaves cast lazy shadows over stone pathways and students hurried between lectures with iced coffees in hand. The philosophy department was unusually still, its hallways echoing only the distant click of shoes and murmured debate from behind closed doors. Inside one of those offices sat Dr. Richard Sullivan, a professor whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his devotion to his students. He was waiting for one of them, 27-year-old Gabriel Young, a promising graduate student whose mind was as sharp as it was fragile. No one could have imagined that in the next few minutes, this quiet meeting over a failed thesis would end with a murder that would haunt the university forever. Witnesses later said they heard raised voices from behind the office door, an argument about academic integrity, about failure, about the worth of a man's life's work. Then came the first sound of impact. Not a gunshot, not a scream, but a dull, rhythmic thud that echoed down the corridor like the beating of a heart losing control. Students froze mid-step. The noise came again, louder, harder, until it stopped entirely. The silence that followed was so complete it felt unnatural, a pause in time that separated everything before from everything after. When the door finally opened 15 minutes later, it wasn't Dr. Sullivan who emerged. It was Gabriel, his hands stained red, his glasses cracked, and his face expressionless, as if he'd just concluded a difficult experiment. When campus security arrived, they found him sitting calmly in the visitor's chair across from Sullivan's lifeless body. The brass statue of Rodin's The Thinker, an award once given to Sullivan for academic excellence, sat on the desk between them, its surface slick with blood. Gabriel didn't resist arrest. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. "I killed him," he told the officers in a voice so even it chilled them. "He failed my thesis. I accepted the consequence." There was no attempt to flee, no effort to hide evidence, just the surreal image of a man who had committed an unspeakable act and then waited patiently for justice to arrive, as if the entire scene had been preordained. Word spread across the campus within hours. Students huddled in shock outside the philosophy building, their voices trembling with disbelief. Professors wept quietly in offices they could no longer enter without fear. News crews descended on Miami University, filming palm-lined walkways that had turned into crime scenes. For those who knew Dr. Sullivan, the loss was personal. He wasn't just a scholar. He was a mentor, a moral compass, a friend. The image of his once lively office, now sealed off by yellow tape, became a symbol of how fragile the boundary between brilliance and madness can be. Behind that door, a philosophical debate had transformed into a tragedy. And yet, what unsettled people most wasn't just the murder. It was the motive. Gabriel's acts seemed almost ritualistic, his confession disturbingly rational. He told detectives he wanted to face the maximum penalty possible, as if he believed death was a logical resolution to his failure. It left investigators, jurors, and the public wondering, was this the story of a man consumed by perfection, or proof that intellect, when twisted by obsession, can justify even the most horrific of crimes? As the sun set over the Miami skyline that night, the campus lights flickered on one by one, illuminating a community forever changed. The halls where knowledge once thrived had fallen silent, and in that silence began one of Florida's most unsettling murder cases. When Detective Benjamin Price arrived at the philosophy department that afternoon, the first thing he noticed wasn't the blood, the broken statue, or the horror of the crime scene. It was the quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every sound feel wrong. Gabriel Young sat in that silence, his posture straight, his expression composed, as though he'd been waiting for an appointment rather than his own arrest. Price would later say he'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of police work. He looked like a man who had just finished grading papers, not a man who'd just taken a life, he recalled. The officers read him his rights, and Gabriel nodded politely, even correcting one of them on the proper wording of a legal clause. That eerie composure unsettled everyone in the room. It was as if Gabriel had rehearsed this moment in his mind long before it ever happened. At the station, his behavior only deepened the sense of unease. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't protest his detention, and didn't even request water or food. When Price began the interrogation, Gabriel answered every question with surgical precision. He confessed without hesitation. He described the argument, the exact number of strikes, the symbolic reason for using the professor's award statue, every detail delivered in calm, emotionless sentences. "It wasn't rage," he said. "It was necessity. He destroyed my work. I destroyed the source of that destruction." There was no hint of remorse, no flicker of guilt in his tone. To Price, it was as though Gabriel believed himself the protagonist of a philosophical experiment rather than a murderer facing life or death. That logic, the cold, deliberate kind, was more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't an impulsive act. The methodical nature of his confession, the precision of his statements, even the way he'd cleaned his fingerprints from the office door handle while leaving them clearly visible on the weapon, all of it pointed to someone making a statement rather than covering a crime. A search of his apartment confirmed that theory. Everything was immaculate, neatly labeled, obsessively organized. On his desk sat a sealed envelope addressed to Miami-Dade investigators. Inside, a typed letter dated the day before the murder detailed his plan, motive, and intention to accept the death penalty. Gabriel had written, "The purity of justice requires acceptance. My guilt is total. My punishment must be absolute." It was as if he'd been trying to orchestrate not just a murder, but a moral lesson, one that ended with his own execution. For Detective Price and his team, that revelation shifted everything. They weren't chasing a suspect anymore. They were unraveling the psychology of a man who wanted to be punished. Price found himself haunted by one question. Why didn't he run? The answer, he suspected, was that Gabriel saw the arrest as the final step in a philosophical argument. By confessing, by embracing punishment, he was completing his theory of moral absolutism. But to the officers who watched him sit calmly in the interrogation room, it wasn't philosophy, it was madness. "He was too calm," one officer said later. "Too certain, like he'd made peace with something the rest of us couldn't understand." News outlets began calling him the Calm Killer, a title that spread quickly across Florida's television screens. But those who had seen him up close said the word calm didn't do it justice. It was something deeper, something cold. The footage of his interrogation would later go viral. Gabriel, seated at a gray metal table, hands folded neatly, explaining his crime like a lecture on ethics. Viewers couldn't look away. Some saw intelligence warped by obsession. Others saw a broken mind using reason as camouflage for insanity. But for the people who had to face him in court, there was one chilling truth. Gabriel Young didn't fear death. He was inviting it. Before the murder, Gabriel Young had been known on campus as brilliant but reclusive, the kind of student who lived more in his thoughts than in the real world. His professors described him as methodical, passionate, and exhausting, a man who dissected moral philosophy as if he were trying to reprogram the universe itself. He spent nights alone in the library, long after the janitors had finished their rounds, surrounded by towers of books marked with notes and color-coded tabs. To his classmates, he was an enigma, polite but detached, always walking with the intense stillness of someone carrying an invisible burden. What they didn't know was that Gabriel's obsession with his doctoral thesis, an argument defending moral absolutism in a morally fluid world, had consumed not only his time, but his sanity. Every critique from his advisor felt like a personal assault, every suggestion like an attack on his identity. And when his thesis was finally rejected, something inside him cracked so completely that reason turned into ruin. The early signs had been there, hidden in plain sight. Emails between Gabriel and Dr. Sullivan showed a pattern of growing tension, polite exchanges turning into veiled frustration. Sullivan had tried to guide him, even granting multiple extensions and offering mentorship beyond the normal boundaries of academia. But Gabriel's ego had fused with his work. His sense of worth lived and died by every word written on those pages. Friends recalled how he began skipping meals, neglecting sleep, even muttering philosophical arguments under his breath during late-night study sessions. One student remembered finding him at 3 in the morning, surrounded by papers, whispering, "He doesn't understand. None of them do." To them, it looked like typical grad school stress. To detectives later on, it looked like the moment when obsession metastasized into something far darker. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Gabriel had become consumed by a need for validation so extreme that rejection felt like annihilation. His search history was filled with phrases like famous philosophers who were misunderstood and moral justification for extreme acts. His journal, meticulously typed and printed, read less like reflections and more like manifestos. One entry from weeks before the murder read, "If truth exists beyond compromise, then failure to recognize it is moral corruption." Another, "Sullivan's rejection isn't critique, it's suppression, and suppression must have consequences." These weren't the words of a student anymore. They were the thoughts of a man constructing a justification for violence. It was philosophy stripped of humanity, logic used to erase empathy. Those who knew him personally struggled to reconcile the Gabriel they'd known with the killer he'd become. He had once volunteered as a tutor for undergrads, once organized study groups for ethics students, even quoted Dr. Sullivan in admiration. Yet as his isolation deepened, that admiration curdled into resentment. To Gabriel, Sullivan wasn't just a teacher anymore. He became the embodiment of a corrupt system that judged worth through gatekeeping. The day before the murder, Gabriel submitted his final draft and told a classmate, "Tomorrow decides everything. Either my life continues or it doesn't." The words sounded dramatic at the time, but in hindsight, they were a confession hidden in plain sight. By the time detectives pieced together his dissent, it was too late to change the ending. The pressure, the debt, the intellectual pride, all of it had collapsed into a perfect storm of obsession and despair. Gabriel's mind had turned inward, like a mirror reflecting only itself. His thesis had begun as a study of moral principles, but in the end, it became a manifesto for self-destruction. The tragedy wasn't just that he killed his professor. It was that he believed he was right to do it. When Detective Price read those final journal entries, he whispered what everyone else was thinking, but no one dared to say out loud. He didn't lose control. He lost perspective. Before he became a victim in one of Florida's most shocking academic murders. Dr. Richard Sullivan was something rare in the world of higher education, a philosopher who didn't just teach ethics, he lived them. Colleagues described him as brilliant but humble, a man who could discuss Aristotle one moment and help a janitor carry boxes the next. His office was a sanctuary of thought, lined with worn-out books, annotated manuscripts, and photos of former students he'd guided to success. He believed that philosophy wasn't about debate, it was about how you live when no one's watching. To those who studied under him, he wasn't merely a professor, he was a compass. The irony that his life would be taken by a student obsessed with morality wasn't lost on anyone. It was as if fate itself had chosen to test every principle he ever taught. Dr. Sullivan had spent decades building a reputation as one of Miami University's most respected thinkers. His research on moral psychology had shaped modern discussions on conscience and ethical decision-making. Students admired his intellect, but what truly drew them in was his empathy. He remembered names, remembered faces, remembered the details that made every student feel seen. He made you believe your thoughts mattered, one of his former pupils said at the memorial service. He didn't just critique their ideas, he challenged them to become better versions of themselves. That was what made Gabriel Young's betrayal so unfathomable. Sullivan had fought for him, mentored him, and even defended him when others questioned his academic progress. In trying to save Gabriel, he may have unknowingly stepped closer to the edge of his own undoing. Emails later recovered from Dr. Sullivan's computer painted a haunting picture of his final weeks. He had met with Gabriel 3 times in the last week of his life, each session growing tenser. In one message to the department chair, Sullivan wrote, "I'm increasingly worried about Gabriel's fixation on this project. He's tying his entire identity to the outcome. He needs help, but I'm not sure he'll accept it from me." Despite these warning signs, he refused to abandon his student. In his eyes, mentorship meant responsibility, to guide, to protect, even when it became uncomfortable. His wife, Dr. Catherine Sullivan, would later testify that he often came home troubled but hopeful. "Richard believed everyone could be reasoned with," she said softly. "He thought Gabriel just needed perspective." That faith in human reason, his life's philosophy, would prove fatal. When the crime scene photos were later shown in court, they revealed a tragic irony. Dr. Sullivan had died in the very space where he dedicated his life to understanding moral reasoning. The desk where he once wrote papers on virtue ethics was now stained with his own blood. The award statue he had cherished as a symbol of enlightenment had become the weapon that ended him. For those who knew him, that image was unbearable. A philosopher slain by the very ideals he spent his life defending. Students left flowers and handwritten notes outside his office door for months afterward. One read, "You taught us that knowledge must be used for good. I wish he had remembered that." In the end, Dr. Sullivan's legacy outshone the darkness that took him. His colleagues completed his unfinished manuscript, a book titled Living What We Teach, Ethics as Practice, which became a posthumous bestseller among educators and philosophers alike. It stood as both a tribute and a warning, a reminder that intellect without empathy is a dangerous thing. To this day, Miami University holds an annual lecture in his honor, where speakers discuss not only moral philosophy, but also the human cost of academic pressure. As one professor said during the first memorial, "Richard believed reason could save us, but this case reminds us it can also destroy us when stripped of compassion." From the very beginning, detectives knew this wasn't going to be a typical homicide investigation. There were no mysterious footprints to track, no frantic search for a missing suspect, no conflicting witness statements. The killer had already confessed. In fact, he'd confessed before anyone even asked him to. For Detective Benjamin Price, that was both a relief and a burden. The who and how were obvious. The challenge was understanding the why. When Price entered Gabriel Young's apartment later that night, he expected chaos. Scattered papers, signs of struggle, something to show a man unraveling. Instead, he found order so precise it was disturbing. Every book aligned by subject, every notebook labeled in identical handwriting, every page of his thesis printed, annotated, and stacked with mathematical precision. It was less an apartment and more a shrine to intellect. And buried inside it, detectives found the manifesto that turned this case from tragedy into philosophical nightmare. The letter Gabriel left behind was chillingly calm. Addressed to investigating authorities, it outlined his reasoning in a tone that read more like an academic essay than a confession. "The rejection of my thesis," he wrote, "constitutes the moral invalidation of my existence. If moral truth is absolute, then the destruction of truth demands an equal consequence." Every line was crafted with surgical care, free of emotion but full of conviction. He signed it not as Gabriel Young, but as author of Moral Absolutism, a final experiment. The statement was dated the day before the killing, proving that the act wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, meticulously planned, and philosophically rationalized. For investigators, that document became both the key to the case and a window into a mind that saw murder not as evil, but as justice executed by his own hand. Digital forensics uncovered more evidence that Gabriel had been preparing for weeks. His search history included chillingly specific phrases: Florida death penalty eligibility, symbolic murders in philosophy, Rodin's The Thinker Award Miami faculty. It was as though he'd mapped out not only how to kill, but how to make the act itself a statement. On his laptop, detectives found a folder titled Responses to Rejection, containing research on historical figures who reacted violently to academic criticism. Each file included notes analyzing whether their actions were justified by moral reasoning. Some were philosophers, others scientists, a few were infamous criminals. At the bottom of one document, Gabriel had written in italics, "They failed because they fled. I will not." That line sent a chill through every investigator who read it. He wasn't just planning a murder, he was preparing for martyrdom. Detective Price later described his reaction in a court testimony. "I've handled drug killings, domestic disputes, organized hits, but nothing like this," he said. "It's one thing to see a murder born of rage or desperation. It's another to read one planned like a thesis defense." What disturbed Price most wasn't the violence. It was the logic. Gabriel's reasoning was airtight within its own twisted framework. He wasn't insane in the chaotic sense. He was frighteningly lucid. Every step he took that day, from wiping the doorknob to sitting patiently beside the body, was consistent with his belief that truth demanded consequences. Price called it a philosopher's version of self-destruction, a man proving his own moral theory by sacrificing his life to it. It was madness, but the kind that wore a scholar's face and spoke in calm, articulate sentences. When the evidence was presented to the district attorney, the prosecution had everything it needed: motive, confession, physical proof, and written intent. What they didn't have was a precedent. How do you prosecute a man who's begging for the maximum penalty? How do you ensure justice when the defendant's ultimate goal is death? Those questions would haunt the Miami legal community for months. In the public's eyes, Gabriel Young wasn't just a killer. He was a paradox, a man too rational to plead insanity and too broken to want mercy. The investigation might have ended in a single day, but the moral reckoning it sparked was only beginning. As Detective Price wrote in his final report, Gabriel Young gave us the rarest kind of case, a closed file that opened 1,000 questions. By the time the court proceedings began, one thing had become disturbingly clear. Gabriel Young didn't view his crime as murder. He viewed it as moral equilibrium. Sitting in his orange prison uniform, shackled but serene, he spoke to the psychologists assigned to his evaluation with the poise of a lecturer addressing a class. "You believe justice is a system," he told one of them. "I believe justice is a principle. Systems corrupt principles." His tone wasn't defiant, just factual, as though he were explaining the laws of gravity rather than defending an act of violence. The psychiatrists found no signs of psychosis or delusion. Instead, they found hyper-rationality, a condition where intellect overrides empathy. Gabriel's logic was impeccable, but his humanity had been amputated by it. He'd constructed a mental equation where morality was measured in consequences, not compassion. To him, killing Dr. Sullivan wasn't an outburst. It was an inevitable conclusion. His defense team struggled to humanize him, to convince the jury that beneath the cold exterior was a broken man, not an evil one. But Gabriel's own testimony made that nearly impossible. During one pretrial hearing, he asked to speak directly to the court. The judge, hesitant but curious, allowed it. What followed left everyone in the room frozen. "I do not seek forgiveness," Gabriel said. "Forgiveness implies wrongdoing. I acted in moral accordance with the truth as I understood it. My professor's rejection was a denial of objective reality. In doing so, he corrupted the moral order. I merely restored balance." There was no remorse in his eyes, no tremor in his voice. He wasn't performing. He believed every word. The courtroom air thickened with disbelief. Even the journalists, seasoned in tragedy, struggled to write headlines that captured what they'd just witnessed. Experts were brought in to explain how intellect, when isolated from empathy, could twist into justification for atrocity. Dr. Helen Rivas, a clinical psychologist, testified that Gabriel's reasoning reflected philosophical narcissism, a delusion of moral grandeur rooted in excessive intellect. "He didn't lose control," she said. "He lost context. He built a universe where only his reasoning mattered." The prosecution seized on that statement. To them, Gabriel wasn't a genius misunderstood by society. He was a self-appointed judge and executioner. "He turned philosophy into theology," the prosecutor argued, "and he made himself the god of it." Those words echoed across national headlines, transforming the trial into a cultural debate about intellect, arrogance, and the limits of moral reasoning. In interviews broadcast across the country, philosophers, ethicists, and criminal psychologists weighed in. Some argued Gabriel's act was a grotesque distortion of moral logic. Others saw it as a tragic example of what happens when academia isolates intellect from emotional grounding. One commentator on CNN summarized it perfectly. "He didn't kill out of hate. He killed out of certainty." That certainty became the theme of the entire case, how absolute belief, even in something as noble as truth, can mutate into destruction when unchecked by empathy. Gabriel himself seemed proud that the world was finally discussing his ideas. When reporters shouted questions at him as he was escorted into court, he simply smiled and said, "At least they're thinking." As the trial progressed, even the prosecution found themselves unnerved by his composure. He never faltered, never raised his voice, never seemed afraid. When the judge asked if he understood that the death penalty could be applied, he nodded and said, "I would expect nothing less." It was as though he'd written his own ending and was merely watching it unfold. The courtroom had seen killers cry, rage, and plead, but never one who intellectualized his own death. For many, it wasn't just the murder that horrified them. It was the realization that Gabriel Young believed himself righteous. Logic, stripped of love, had turned lethal. And as the world watched, one question hung heavy in the air. When reason justifies murder, what's left to keep the rest of us human? The Miami-Dade County courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the first day of Gabriel Young's trial. Students, professors, journalists, and ordinary citizens filled every seat, their eyes fixed on the man who had turned philosophy into a weapon. The air was tense, a cocktail of curiosity and quiet dread. Even Judge Mariah Colton, known for her composure in high-profile cases, seemed unusually restrained as she called the proceedings to order. Gabriel sat at the defense table with his hands folded neatly, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a student waiting for his turn to speak. The prosecution began by projecting photos of the crime scene: Dr. Sullivan's office, the shattered statue, the crimson stains on white pages of philosophy notes. A gasp rippled through the audience, but Gabriel didn't blink. When the prosecutor described the act as cold-blooded, Gabriel quietly corrected him: calculated. That single word echoed louder than any shout could. Throughout the trial, his behavior remained unnervingly consistent. While his public defender, Thomas Avery, fought to introduce an insanity defense, Gabriel rejected it outright. "I'm not insane," he told the judge. "I am accountable." Avery begged him to stay silent, to let him argue diminished capacity, but Gabriel refused. He wanted the jury to understand his reasoning, even if it condemned him. During cross-examination, the prosecution questioned his lack of emotion, his deliberate planning, and his chilling manifesto. Gabriel answered with precision. "If truth is absolute," he said at one point, "then deviation from it is corruption. Corruption demands correction." Every time he spoke, the courtroom felt colder. Even the jurors, 12 ordinary citizens, seemed torn between horror and fascination. One later told reporters, "He didn't sound crazy. He sounded convinced." The prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the murder weapon, Gabriel's confession, and the premeditated letter. They showed his emails, his search history, his journal entries, all of it pointing to intent. But what shook the courtroom wasn't the evidence. It was his acceptance of guilt. "Do you regret killing Dr. Sullivan?" the prosecutor asked during one exchange. Gabriel tilted his head slightly. "Regret implies error," he said softly. "I made none." That moment broke something in the room. A spectator stood up and shouted, "You're a monster!" before being escorted out. Yet even then, Gabriel didn't react. His detachment was absolute. It wasn't defiance. It was conviction. The only flicker of emotion came when the judge asked him directly if he understood that the state would seek the death penalty. "Yes," he said with calm finality. "It's what I've earned." Behind closed doors, Judge Colton struggled with the weight of the case. To her, Gabriel wasn't a typical defendant. He was articulate, intelligent, and terrifyingly rational. During recesses, she could be seen reviewing transcripts alone, trying to understand how a human being could so fully surrender empathy to intellect. "He believes this is justice," she told a clerk quietly. "How do you punish someone who's already at peace with punishment?" The jury deliberated for only 4 hours, a remarkably short time for a capital case. When they returned, the foreman's voice trembled as he read the verdict. "Guilty of first-degree murder." Gabriel simply nodded, then turned to the judge and said, "Thank you." The entire courtroom fell silent. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps that evening, their cameras flashing as police escorted Gabriel back to custody. The headlines the next morning were chilling. "The Philosopher of Death. Killer thanks jury for conviction." Across talk shows and classrooms, debates erupted. Was Gabriel Young a criminal or a cautionary symbol of intellect unbound? The trial had done more than decide his fate. It had cracked open a moral paradox the world couldn't stop discussing. Inside that Miami courtroom, law and philosophy had collided, and for a moment, it was unclear which one had truly won. Gabriel's calm smile as he was led away lingered in the public imagination like a ghostly reminder that justice, no matter how precise, can never heal the wounds it exposes. In the weeks following the verdict, Psychologists and behavioral experts from across the country descended on Miami, drawn by the enigma that was Gabriel Young. His case defied nearly every established profile of a murderer. He wasn't driven by greed, jealousy, or revenge. He didn't fit the criteria for psychosis or antisocial personality disorder. Instead, his motive stemmed from something rarer and infinitely more chilling: a philosophical death wish. To understand Gabriel, experts had to enter the mind of a man who viewed his own execution not as punishment, but as fulfillment. "He's not suicidal in the clinical sense," said Dr. Helen Rivas in an interview. "He's moral suicidal. He wants his death to mean something, to validate a principle." That notion left even seasoned analysts unsettled. For most people, death is the end of meaning. For Gabriel, it was proof of it. The state-appointed psychiatrists who examined him described his intellect as extraordinary and his detachment as absolute. During evaluations, Gabriel spoke about morality as if discussing mathematics. "In every equation," he told one doctor, "there must be balance. I introduced imbalance by killing him. Death is my correction." He never wept, never expressed fear. When asked if he'd prefer life in prison, he replied, "Life without truth is imprisonment. Death in truth is freedom." To many, these statements sounded poetic. To psychologists, they were terrifyingly consistent with a man who had converted reason into religion. Dr. Rivas later wrote that Gabriel's emotional flatness wasn't numbness, it was discipline. He had trained himself to suppress empathy because he viewed it as a weakness that clouded logic. In essence, he had rationalized his own dehumanization. The prison staff, too, began to notice the eerie serenity surrounding him. Guards reported that Gabriel never raised his voice, never argued, and never showed frustration. He spent his hours reading philosophy books or writing letters that resembled essays rather than correspondence. In one, addressed to his defense attorney, he wrote, "Do not seek appeal. Appeals imply doubt. Doubt dilutes justice." Another, written to the Miami Herald but never published, stated, "Society fears what it cannot categorize. They will call me insane because sanity to them is compliance." These writings became evidence that Gabriel's desire for death wasn't a plea, it was a thesis conclusion. He was crafting a narrative where his execution completed the philosophical arc he'd been constructing for years. And in his mind, once the state carried out that sentence, the equation would finally balance. Meanwhile, the public's fascination with his psychology deepened. Documentaries, podcasts, and talk shows debated whether Gabriel's logic was evidence of genius or madness. Some commentators drew comparisons to historical figures who had romanticized death as an intellectual act, from Socrates to the Stoics to the nihilists of modern philosophy. But others rejected that romantic lens entirely. "He's not Socrates," one ethicist declared on live television. "Socrates died for questioning power. Gabriel killed for being questioned." That distinction mattered. Gabriel's death wish wasn't about sacrifice. It was about control. By asking for execution, he robbed the system of its moral superiority. It was his way of turning punishment into triumph, death into authorship. When reporters finally asked Judge Colton how she interpreted his insistence on dying, she paused for a long moment before answering. "I think he believes this is the only way to make sense of himself," she said softly. "But that doesn't make it noble. It makes it tragic." The state psychologists agreed. They concluded that Gabriel was competent to be executed, fully aware of his actions and consequences. His mind, they said, was not broken. It was weaponized. In the end, Gabriel's greatest act of defiance wasn't the murder itself. It was how peacefully he accepted his own end. He had turned death into philosophy, and in doing so, stripped it of fear. But to those who watched him await his sentence in eerie calm, one question refused to die. If a man can reason himself into destruction, how many others could follow him there? The day of Gabriel Young's sentencing dawned under a heavy Miami sky, gray clouds pressing low over the courthouse as if the city itself was holding its breath. Reporters gathered early, their cameras pointed toward the courthouse steps, where the fate of one of Florida's most controversial killers would be sealed. Inside, the courtroom was filled once again. Students, journalists, and strangers drawn by morbid curiosity. But this time, the air felt different. The outrage had dimmed into something quieter, a collective exhaustion from trying to understand the man who claimed to have already accepted his own death. When Gabriel entered, dressed in the same orange uniform he'd worn throughout the trial, there was a strange stillness that followed him. No one spoke, no one whispered. He moved like a man walking to an appointment he'd scheduled himself. Judge Mariah Colton, her expression drawn but steady, began the proceedings. "Mr. Young," she said, her voice clear but strained, "you have been found guilty of first-degree murder. Before I deliver the sentence, do you have anything to say?" Gabriel stood, hands cuffed, his gaze unwavering. "Only that justice should not be delayed," he said softly. "A principle means nothing without completion." A shiver ran through the courtroom. Even the judge seemed momentarily unsettled. The prosecutor read a brief statement on behalf of Dr. Sullivan's family, words of grief, anger, and incomprehension. But Gabriel didn't look at them once. His attention remained fixed on the judge, as though he were waiting for her to validate the last piece of his theory. Then, in a voice that trembled only slightly, Judge Colton read the sentence. "The state of Florida hereby sentences you, Gabriel Young, to death by lethal injection." Gasps broke through the silence. Some spectators wept, others clapped quietly in grim approval. But Gabriel did not react. He simply nodded, his lips parting in what could almost be mistaken for relief. "Finally," he whispered. The bailiffs moved to escort him out, but he turned toward the judge one last time. "You've done what was necessary," he said. "Thank you." The judge froze, unsure whether she had just condemned a man or completed his mission. Outside, the media erupted into a frenzy of flashing lights and breaking news headlines. "Florida killer gets his death wish." It was a phrase that would dominate headlines for weeks, echoing through television studios and courtroom debates alike. Yet, within the chaos, one truth remained. The man at the center of it all had gotten exactly what he wanted. In the weeks that followed, as Gabriel awaited transfer to death row, public opinion fractured. Some saw him as the embodiment of arrogance, a man so consumed by pride he manipulated the justice system into granting him martyrdom. Others, disturbingly, saw him as a tragic philosopher, a man who lived and died by his own ideals. The governor's office received petitions both for clemency and for an expedited execution. Gabriel himself refused all interviews, writing only one letter to the court. "Justice fulfilled is justice complete. I am ready." Psychologists continued to study him, theologians debated him, and universities quietly began discussing how to address the Young paradox, the danger of intellect divorced from empathy. On the day of his transfer, reporters shouted questions as guards led him toward the armored van. "Do you regret it?" one yelled. Gabriel paused, turned slightly, and replied, "Regret is a comfort for those uncertain of their choices." Then he smiled faintly and stepped inside. As the doors closed behind him, the sound of metal echoed across the courtyard, final and cold. Judge Colton, watching from her chambers, whispered to her clerk, "He wanted to die for an idea. We gave him what he asked for. But did we just validate him?" Her words lingered in the air like a confession. The system had delivered justice by every legal measure, but in doing so, it had also completed the killer's philosophy. Gabriel Young's death sentence wasn't the end of his story. It was the final argument in a thesis that had taken an innocent man's life and turned the courtroom itself into his final lecture hall. In the months after Gabriel Young's sentencing, the world moved on. But not entirely. Miami University reopened the philosophy department under new leadership, the walls repainted, the carpets replaced, yet the ghost of what happened there never really left. Dr. Sullivan's old office remained sealed for months before it was finally turned into a quiet memorial room filled with his books and a bronze plaque bearing the words, "Wisdom without empathy is ruin." Students came and went, whispering about the man who turned his mentor's death into a philosophical statement, a symbol of intellect gone wrong. The tragedy forced the academic world to confront uncomfortable questions about pressure, pride, and the way intellect can become a trap when divorced from humanity. Professors began rethinking how they handled students teetering on the edge, and for the first time, mental health was treated not as weakness, but as survival. Yet beneath it all lingered an uneasy truth, for all society had learned the same arrogance that destroyed Gabriel was still woven into the human condition. Journalists continued to dissect the case for months. Documentaries, op-eds, and podcasts all tried to decode his motives. The story became a mirror for every audience who encountered it. Some saw tragedy, others saw warning, and a few, disturbingly, saw brilliance. "He made us talk about morality again," one philosopher said during a televised panel. But at what cost? The fascination never truly faded because Gabriel represented something most people feared to admit, that the same logic that builds civilization can also justify its darkest acts when empathy is removed from the equation. On death row, before his execution date was finalized, Gabriel reportedly spent his time reading his own writings, annotating the margins, adding corrections, as if he were still refining his argument. One guard later described him as the calmest man I've ever seen in chains. That serenity wasn't peace, it was conviction. He had gotten what he wanted, validation through punishment, immortality through infamy. When the day of his execution came, it was as quiet as the afternoon he had taken a life. There were no last-minute appeals, no desperate pleas, no tears. Gabriel refused spiritual counsel and declined to make a final statement. As the needle slid beneath his skin, he simply looked toward the glass where witnesses watched and said one final word: balance. Within minutes, it was over. His body was cremated, his ashes unclaimed. For the world, it marked closure. But for those who had studied his case, it marked something far more disturbing, a reminder that reason, stripped of empathy, can become the deadliest form of madness. Dr. Sullivan's widow, when asked how she felt after the execution, gave an answer that silenced the room. "You can kill the man, but not the idea that made him dangerous. That idea will find new minds if we stop teaching compassion." In the years that followed, Gabriel's writings were banned from most academic archives, though they still circulated online in dark corners of philosophy forums, where some young thinkers debated his theories as though he were a misunderstood visionary. Miami University began a mandatory ethics seminar for graduate students, built around Dr. Sullivan's work, not Gabriel's. The first lesson in that class quoted Sullivan directly. "Truth without kindness isn't enlightenment. It's cruelty disguised as logic." That quote became the motto of the department and, in time, a universal warning whispered in classrooms everywhere. Professors taught their students that brilliance was not the goal of knowledge, balance was, and that no amount of intellect could ever replace the moral weight of empathy. Today, when people revisit the case of Gabriel Young, it's rarely to glorify him. It's to understand how fragile the line is between thought and delusion, between genius and destruction. His name has become a cautionary tale, his story an echo of humanity's oldest struggle, the war between reason and compassion. For every mind that hungers for truth, there's a lesson buried in his legacy. That intelligence, when left unchecked by conscience, becomes a weapon. And for every society that praises intellect over empathy, Gabriel Young remains a haunting reminder of what happens when the pursuit of truth forgets the humanity it was meant to serve. In the end, both men, teacher and student, left behind the same moral lesson, written not in books, but in blood. Knowledge without love destroys, and every civilization that forgets that truth will one day face its own judgment.